I was introducing, just recording this, guys. I hope that's all right. There's going to be a great amount of content here to keep and share. For those who don't know, I'm Andrew Cameron, Byron Shire Council Ag Extension Officer. It's a great opportunity to have Kim Dean from Reinventing Agriculture to discuss, weeds, weeds as indicators, weeds as a management tool or problem or challenge that we all sort of experience as landholders and custodians. And on that note, I would like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the area that most of us reside on and farm on and are custodians ourselves of, part of Bundjalung Nation, and acknowledge the great work that they did for many, many thousands of years looking after this land that we are so very fortunate now to be part of here. And acknowledge all of you for turning up and seeking this knowledge with the intention of being, better custodians and being custodians of the land yourselves. So thank you for turning up. Just a bit of housekeeping. We will have questions at the end, so feel free to write any questions in the chat as we go along. We can sort of clock them, park them to the end, but we can also have a discussion at the end. So thanks for turning up, guys. And thank you, Kim. I will hand it over to you now. And thanks.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And thanks for all of those of you joining live today. It's great to see you. And I'm sure there'll be others watching the recording. So welcome when that happens. While I kick off, I'd love to know your definition of weeds in the chat box. So if you've got a definition of weeds you'd like to share before I start sharing my screen, I'm very curious. But I have been exploring weeds as indicators for a while now. I've been on what I'd now call a regenerative ag path for about 18 years. Started all of this crazy stuff before we really had a term for it. So, but we've been exploring, my husband and I have come from traditional farming backgrounds and started questioning things after having some major aha moments in our probably 20s and 30s, and started doing things very differently. And I've been observing weeds in our landscape and clients' landscapes. At Reinventing Ag, we work in the whole ag as a holistic space, I guess, in agriculture, with soil health, financial management for regenerative ag transitions, and the whole mindset space. We love coaching people around mindset because a lot of the way we approach weeds is related to our mindset, which we'll cover today. Just got a couple of definitions. A plant growing somewhere you do not want it to grow. So basically any plant. I love that, Brooke. A plant out of place. That's the one we were always taught. I know at school, often in ag at school, I remember that one. And Mark says weeds are unwanted plants for a particular situation. All plants have a purpose. I love that. Simon's got weeds are plants or animals that dominate and crowd out an environment, diminishing the productivity of other plants and animals. And spontaneous plants. There's such a great, I'm loving the diversity of answers there. Keep them coming. I'm going to share my screen now and get on with the presentation, and I can check back in later. But it's nice to know you're already got open minds and you're curious about weeds, because we're going to have a really fun little exploration, I guess, of weeds as indicators for the next hour and a bit. Whoops, I don't know what's happening there. Hopefully you can see my screen. What we're going to cover today is we're going to look at our mindset, as I just said, which I can see is a lot of you are already on that path. We're going to explore the ecological principles behind weeds as indicators, which give us an insight into some of the reasons they grow and what they might be telling us about our soil health. And I find this really, really interesting, all of these things, but particularly the soil health. Like, as you said in some of those definitions, they have a purpose and they're there to help us. If we can just start to understand them and get a little bit of a inkling, we can find different ways to approach things. So that's you're letting me know what you think weeds are in the comments in the chat. What I want to say before I kick in is this presentation is really about information. I'm not going to be offering you advice. It's about getting curious. I'm going to share my learnings around looking into weeds as indicators. I certainly think there's still a lot I don't know in this realm, as we all do, but there's a lot I have learned and have enjoyed finding out, and as through observation and research and reading. Your decisions around weed management are your responsibility. Sometimes sometimes there's legal requirements regarding specific plants, which you need to be, that's your responsibility to take that into account. When you start to look at what this weed's telling you and how you deal with it, remember that that's all your choice. None of this is advice, because systems take time to reboot, and in nature, things change a lot more slowly than we might like. So patience is part of it. And it is really about principles applied in context, So today, I'd really like you to start to think about, how do I apply some of these principles Kim's talking about in my context and what I'm dealing with? So, how to get the most out of this webinar today is to probably think about the weeds you are particularly challenged by or curious about. There were lots listed on the registration forms as well. And think about this information today and how that applies in your context. There were as many weeds on those registration forms as there were participants, I think. A couple of people have no weeds, which is cool. Someone didn't have enough room to list them all. But the ones that came through loud and clear, lantana was a clear standout. Farmers' friends were pretty popular: Parramatta grass, camphor laurel, rat's tail grass, and bracken fern. They all turned up a little bit too, but there, like I said, there's as many weeds on that list as there are people registering to apply. Whoops, I've just hit a button there. I might just go back. So I'll just show you, this is a few. I think there may be more weeds came through after Andrew sent me this list, but you can see there's a diversity of different plants that people are curious about and challenged by in your environment. I should have said also, I am based in Gamilaroi country over near Inverell, west of the Great Dividing Range, probably not that far from you guys as the crow flies, but very, very different contexts. So again, these principles apply in all of our contexts. It's just getting us to think about, what is this telling me over here? And our context is vastly different. There's a lot of these plants that here, some of them are weeds over here, and some of them would never survive in this climate and the frosty conditions, etc. So, everyone's got the challenges and the things that work well. And with our weeds, it's no different, is it? So, yeah, and I guess what I really want to encourage you to do, like I said, a lot of this is our mindset. Think about a growth mindset. When we have a growth mindset, some of the stuff today, it could be different. Some of it might be familiar to you, but the growth mindset's going to ask, how does this apply in my context? It's a fixed mindset where we go, oh, that won't work for me, or that, that'll never work. So yeah, I'm encouraging you to stay curious and keep that open mind, practicing the growth mindset when you're thinking about those challenges you've got with weeds. It's really, really helpful when we approach this to look at a longer term solution, when things aren't working so great. How we do that, it's telling ourselves a different story about weeds. And I know a lot of you, with the answers you had to the questions, are already questioning and already trying lots of different things. And that's the first step, isn't it? It's seeing a learning goal instead of performance. So if we're going to look at weeds, our performance goal is it must be dead and gone. And we've often tried to make things dead and gone, and they just keep coming back. So our performance goals are frustrating with weeds. Learning goals are more about, I'm going to try these things and I'm going to watch and see what happens and see what I can learn about this weed and how I can manage it. We also learn from the things that don't work. Often when we're trying on this, do a few different things in a regenerative path, and particularly with weeds, not everything's going to go to plan because it's a complex system. So part of that growth mindset is start to see everything as learning opportunities. We're constantly trying to improve what we do, and over time that will happen if we hold ourselves and learn from what doesn't work and start to look at what we can, move along gradually. We do really need to be consistent with our efforts, but also flexible in our approach, because it may not, one thing that works for one person may not work in another context. So, that's part of how I think we need to look at weeds today, and sort of the base of all of this, really, isn't it? How we react to weeds in our landscapes. This was a range of things that came through the questionnaire, the registration one. So I love seeing so many different approaches. Now you'll notice it's a little bit dodgy on the formatting because I had to put the words together, or they all got spread out in the word cloud, but people are brush cutting, they're observing, some people are buffering with fulvic acid, chipping, ripping, slashing was pretty popular, grazing management, cover crops, spot spraying, there's chickens in rotation, live and let live. There was a really nice range of different ways you react to weeds in those questionnaires, which was really, really lovely for me to read. And so I think, part of this is just going to add to your toolbox, and hopefully there'll be some little snippets I share with you that might just increase, the way you implement some of these tools or the timing. Generally, though, what I see in my work in agriculture is a lot of the time, and I've experienced this myself, the way we react to weeds is we're trained to kill, and it's an interesting approach, isn't it? That's part of that mindset shift. And sometimes, even though we might be trying different things, sometimes we can still be in a killing mentality with our management, and can still be getting really challenged. Even when we're not doing herbicides, we might be doing other things, trying to kill. And it really does take a lot of time, energy, and resources to do that. We sometimes still need to manage a weed. I'm not saying that that's okay, but it's more about taking a holistic approach and starting to work with nature rather than constantly push against it. What concerns me a lot when we look at this, train to kill approach is the cost of money we spend on weed control, particularly herbicides. It's billions of dollars that leaves our rural communities and never comes back on, all of the different ways we've been trying to kill things with chemicals, particularly. And sometimes chemicals have a role. They're a tool in the toolbox, but where we get in trouble is when they become the only tool in the toolbox and we can't see any other options, and, we've got so much of that linked to declining soil health, human health, rainfall use efficiency, all the rest of it. So it's not really working that great. We've also, before we adopted herbicides, we'd been trained to cultivate, which also has its challenges for soil health as well. So, it's been a bit of a long journey and a lot of conditioning around that. And it can take a little bit to shift it. Like, it can feel uncomfortable when you think about it. It does put some people out of their comfort zone. And I think the trick is to find a few different ways to approach the problem challenge plants you have, and take a more integrated approach. Because I think there is a lot more to weeds than, we just have to kill them. And once we start to get curious, it's actually really fascinating what you learn. It was interesting. I read an article recently that the Royal Horticultural Society in England had declared that the Chelsea Flower Show was all about weeds. And it was all about, seeing those plants as resilient. And biodiversity aspects, which is really interesting, that there's this little undercurrent of shifting the way we see things, isn't it? And it is really about questioning curiosity and our mindset. What perspective are we going to take on these plants? Really, how we view them as the biggest challenge we have. I think one of the most common questions I hear when we start to talk with weeds as indicators is, how do we kill things more nicely? And that can happen at field days, workshops, online. It's like we all want to do things more nicely, but sometimes, when we change the way we look at things, everything shifts. And sometimes, yes, we do use these tools to move a plant on, or we have a strategic reason for it, but it is really to start to kind of look at the whole picture and what we're doing, and the outcomes of things that we do with the short-term approach versus a long-term approach for me. And it is, getting out of our comfort zone and where are we focusing. So when we're looking at the perspective we're taking, that's huge. And what are we focusing on? Because that's going to have a real bearing on what we see, where we put our attention, energy flows. So, that's going to determine what outcomes we get. And it's really, when we're talking about weeds, it's more about, I think, managing for what we want. Because if we just look at the weed, we're sometimes missing the fact that if we're managing for soil health, eventually the weeds would be shifting. Or if we're managing for, different outcomes other than just killing weeds. So it's really to take a perspective of the bigger picture and then adjust our management of plants we don't want in line with that, I guess. And it is really about questioning assumptions. Assumptions are things we believe are true that we never question. So if you guys are on this webinar, you're probably already questioning assumptions and you're curious. And we go out into the world and not everyone's doing that, but I guess it is just to go, well, sometimes, we might make assumptions about things, or we might assume something won't work, or assume something to be true just because we've been told it for 30 years. So it's really about questioning that. There's one big assumption I think that holds a lot of people back with weeds. What would the neighbours think? It's a classic. And, people are worried that they're going to be a bad farmer if they let those plants we call weeds grow. They're worried they're gonna, the neighbors will get cranky. They'll, look like they're not keeping up with things. They're not going to be doing the right thing. That whole fear of what will people think, or being a bad farmer, really holds people back from trying different things. And it is really interesting. I've had people who've let plants grow intentionally to heal the soil and have people calling in to see if they're okay, because there's these weeds in the front paddock and they're worrying they're not keeping up. So this is like when we start talking about assumptions, that's a key one. But what if we change that perspective and start to see farmers letting plants grow to heal the soil, and that can be done intentionally and managed, so it is a different way to look at it. And it's that reframe, I think. So it's really all about that, isn't it? And it is thinking about, how are these weeds telling a story of our landscape and our management? What are they telling us about our soil health? What role do they have in restoring soil health? And, can I be a good farmer and use these free, diverse plants to do a job for me? And how can I do that in such a way that I'm not making things worse? So, there's a few tools in this talk today also about monitoring and keeping an eye on these strategies if you start to do things differently, so you can see, how do I know they're going or not? Because sometimes when we focus on weeds, all we see are weeds. If we're having a bad day, we'll see all of them. If you probably all relate to this, if you've been out chipping weeds and you're focusing on that one weed, you'll knock off, you'll go home and you'll see that plant everywhere because we're focusing on it. So it's really about our focus and our mindset around that. I really want to encourage you to take a whole systems view of weeds today. When we look at a whole systems view, we're starting to see the impact that these plants have on the other things, but also the impact the plants and the soil and everything else are having on that plant that we don't want. It's all connected, isn't it? When we start to see a whole system, we also can be more likely to pick up unintended consequences of our actions, because in a complex system, things happen and they can be separate from what we're doing in space and time. Sometimes a lot of our weed control is actually making it worse or creating the perfect conditions for weeds to thrive. So it's about helping us be proactive and addressing the causes, not the symptoms. And that's why I'm really passionate, taking a whole systems approach and giving you some principles that you can apply in your context to see if you can achieve different outcomes with problem plants. When you think about weeds, they're pretty hardy, aren't they? They're really resilient and they will survive anywhere. That's a pretty amazing characteristic. They'll thrive in degraded soil where we can't get the plants we want to grow sometimes. They do survive and persist despite all of the efforts we put into getting rid of them. They are generally our colonizers. They will, in nature, nature doesn't like bare ground, so it puts these plants there to cover their ground, and it's part of that successional process that we'll talk about. But they're holding the soil together, they're repairing, they're actually filling a really important role in an ecosystem. They are often, having deep tap roots, or they're coming down into the soil to bring out nutrients and opening up soils that are compacted. They're part of building soil carbon and organic matter. They're all doing those jobs for us. And sometimes they can have medicinal properties. Sometimes they have poisonous properties. Sometimes they're prickly. And sometimes I often think those prickly plants are saying, keep off, this soil needs a break. But they have all these sorts of characteristics. They're also, some of these plants we call weeds, not all, some are toxic, but some are edible for stock and some are edible for us. Not all of them though, obviously. They're also part of, beneficial insects, birds and biodiversity. A few years ago, I was sitting out with a farmer in a patch of castor oils, and the diversity in that patch of weeds was extraordinary. And it was nothing like that in other parts of the paddock where things weren't growing so great. So as a part of what they're doing, the ecosystem is creating habitat, shelter, diversity. And it's really, really interesting, when you start to look at the medicinal properties of some of these plants, it can be quite surprising. But when you think about their role in the ecosystem, and when you start to explore the weeds that you have in your context, start to think, do they have any of these roles? Because if they do, you might be able to find another plant that could do the job instead. They're cycling minerals, as I said, often have a very deep taproot and are bringing minerals from deep in the subsoil back up. They're breaking up soil compaction. They're covering the soil. They're improving the soil through building soil carbon, through the magic of photosynthesis. They're, like I said, have medicinal properties, and some of them are quite nutritious for us and livestock, particularly the dandelion in this picture. But they also provide, like I said, all those ecosystem services. So I guess it's trying to balance out the challenges with them, because sometimes they have something that, they're taking the place of a plant we would think would be more useful. But balancing all this out to see if that plant's doing one of these jobs, what else could do that instead, A really key part of that whole ecological aspect of weeds is that whole plant successional process. In nature, soil and life starts on bare rock that gets colonized by lichens and mosses that then moves on to the annual plants. If you look at a sand dune at the beach, you guys are way closer to the beach than me, but I love looking at sand dune succession and seeing those plants that first start to grow to hold that sand together and create soil and anchor it for more complex species to start to move in. And that system happens in all different ecosystems. We start with rock, we move through to those plants that will hold soil together. Often very weedy plants are the ones that come first, and then grasses and more perennial grasses as time goes on. Then in a community dynamics, always shifting from those simple to more complex, and nature's always trying to take the system to the more complex climax communities. Often though, in agriculture, the things we do set that whole system backwards, and then nature comes back in trying to set it along forwards again, towards the climax community of forests and trees. So it's an interesting process, and this was a major aha moment for me with weeds, and how I could read their messages better was to start to think about plant succession. It is that really fascinating process, and it also carries on beneath the soil, which is, our soil biological processes also follow this plant successional process. So a lot of our weedy species exist in a more bacterial dominated soil. And when you start to look at the soil food web, we know that bacteria and fungi are the basis of that. They feed and foster the food source for the whole other web of life that is in the soil. So yeah, it's when we start to colonize rock faces, the soils become very bacterial dominated. And as things get more complex over time, perennial grasses like a nice balance between bacteria and fungi. Then as soils become more fungal dominated, we create conditions for more woodier plants and tree crops. And the woody weeds tend to sit a little bit as a fungal soil, but sometimes I think they're a bit of an exception to the rule in some of the things I've seen in the field. But they are sort of more, they don't have a really complex ecosystem when we've got woody weeds. They're in a fairly sleepy soil that, and they're sort of building sometimes the conditions for us to move to this climax where we have the forests and the trees and the orchard crops. I had a major aha about this and planting trees, and we'd struggled to get trees to establish on our site, which was very bacterial and a grassland soil. And I suddenly realized, well, of course, I'm trying to plant these trees in a grassland. It's no wonder they're not thriving and only some are surviving. So, it really does help you start to see that what's happening above the ground's happening below the ground. And there's a successional process in the soil food web as well. So those weedy plants are generally sitting, annual weeds and annual grasses particularly, in this very bacterially dominated soil. So using a fungal dominant compost or compost tea extract, etc., can help shift the community under the soil gradually over time to make it less favorable for some of these plants. And it's an interesting concept that I'm sure there'll be some questions on later. The other thing ecologically that weeds are often involved with is decay processes. So that's the cycling and breakdown of plant residues and carbon in the soil. Carbon's cycling through your system. And sometimes there are certain weeds that are trying to help boost the decay processes because they've gone to sleep and they're just not functional. You know, this is sort of part of that mineral cycle in the soil. And, you know, that's part of some of the weeds' role is to help promote that and help move things along. And some weeds are adapted to grow in soils where those processes aren't working very well, where sometimes the plants we're wanting to grow need that process more. So the weeds are there doing a job, growing away, trying to improve the soil until the conditions improve for the next level. The other thing that I find fascinating is the germination signal aspect of weeds. So think about what it takes, you know, we always hear that saying 7 years seeding, 7 years, 1 year seeding, 7 years weeding. That's the one. And I've kind of thrown that out the window lately because I've started to see that plants, you know, nature's incredibly intelligent and a seed is incredibly intelligent and it germinates when the conditions are right for it to germinate. So, you know, seeds can be sitting there for a long, long time until the conditions are right for them to grow. What really factors into that is soil temperature, moisture, exposure to light, you know, the concentration of minerals. So sometimes nitrates can be a real trigger for certain plants. The soil pH, different things going on in the gaseous environment in that soil. But, you know, sometimes when we cultivate soil, we get these plants we haven't seen before for a while. Soil biology, as you saw, can also trigger that germination signal. So if we're disturbing our soil, we're actually setting it back in plant succession and sending signals for some of those plants to grow that might not have been there before. So is it the plant that's the problem, or is the plant just telling us what signal our management's sending? You know, it's telling us a story about what we're doing, isn't it? Sometimes larger seed plants, you know, weeds with really large seeds disappear when we stop cultivating. And sometimes those really tiny seeds really need, you know, they like having light or very slight disturbance. Fleabane is an example that needs light to germinate or to be very shallow. And it's a classic in, you know, in no-till farming. It's one of their biggest problems, but it's constantly getting the conditions it needs to thrive. And it's a prolific seeder. But then in a grassland environment, in a pasture, I've got some photos to show you later, it can disappear in a year after it's done its job. But in a cropping system, it keeps persisting because we keep creating the perfect conditions for it. And that's that germination signal. Like we had a huge fleabane infestation here. If each plant's producing about 100,000 seeds, we haven't seen fleabane since the ground cover returned and things healed. So, you know, those seeds may sit there and wait until another disturbance creates bare ground. But if we manage our ecosystem in a different way, we don't necessarily have to see that weed come back. I also think weeds are a sign that we're not using all of the sunlight, moisture, and nutrients that are there, you know, and they're there to come and do that for us because nature's not going to have their soil. So, you know, it's an interesting one. Another classic I've seen here, we have a very poor soil. It's a sandy granite that was sluiced for tin in the early 1900s. And we don't generally see nitrate accumulating weeds in this soil. After the fire in 2019 that we were impacted by and a drought happened, we believe the soil food web copped decaying and there weren't the higher level organisms to cycle the nitrogen in the bacteria. So as the bacteria died off, this flush of nitrate came and suddenly we had nightshade weeds that we had never seen in 15 years, turning up everywhere, trying to capture that nitrate and cycle it through the system. And we haven't seen it again. But it's interesting to see a plant, like when you've been in the landscape for quite a while, sometimes you see a plant pop up that you've never seen before. And it's there to do a job when we start to understand it. It's just fascinating. But this is a good list also that's really helpful. And it comes out of Nicole Masters' book, For the Love of Soil, the 6 reasons weeds grow. So when you're starting to look at your challenge weed, your curious weed, the one you're curious about today, you think about what reasons here might be resonating with that plant. Is it there to colonize bare soil? Is it low soil organic matter? Is it compaction, a mineral imbalance, a microbial imbalance, such as having a really bacterial soil, or a bit of a sleepy soil where there's woody weeds? Or is it coming in a bit like that nightshade to soak up a toxin and do a job like that? Often, a lot of weeds do respond to a high level of a mineral, and they're there to kind of help it cycle back through the system in a biologically available form. So they're there actually trying to do a job that helps us, and then we keep killing them. So not appreciating that role sometimes. But that's a really key part of your curiosity around the weeds you're dealing with. When we start to look at some of the classic examples of some of those situations, low calcium and low soil humus is common in a lot of weed. Calcium's linked to a lot of weeds, and so is low soil humus. In particular, these sort of plants like the prickly thistles, saffrons, Bathurst burrs, they're often a real sign of calcium. It's the calcium processes in the soil, and this can happen in the soil that has a lot of calcium, but it's not available and it's not cycling through the system. Like, calcium function is really driven by water and fungi. So, sometimes this is also a fact that the fungal activity in the soil is not great as well. I've also noticed some of these plants come after a paddock's been overgrazed in drought because they're prickly, and it's almost like keep off. That's my observation. A lot of plants are coming through the system because there's a really compacted soil with no aeration. A lot of those sedgy plants, we get those a bit up here in the New England, the sedges, but also different things like dock or mallow, they'll have a really deep taproot. Sometimes the soil can be, some of these like waterlogged soil, but it's effectively compaction, it's just no soil aeration. So there can be a bit of a crossover there, but there's some of the classics on that. Thistles can also be compaction as well. But yeah, there's just, when you look at a plant, and I'll encourage you to dig up a problem plant and take a look at its root system and start to get curious about what it's doing underneath the soil, because a lot of them are also trying to help break up the compacted layers. There's a lot of weeds that will indicate high potassium and low phosphorus, generally a lot of the broadleaves. Fleabane is a classic. I've seen soil tests done on a paddock that was really high in fleabane, and those soil tests come back with high potassium. So those plants are coming in trying to help, soak that up and cycle it through the system. It's really, really interesting. And yeah, sometimes also dandelions and some thistles could also fit that role. So some of these plants are going to morph between a few roles, and it's up to you to start to look at your soil and work out what are they trying to do for you. Nitrates is another common signal for weeds, and these are some of the weeds that respond to high nitrates. So your fat hen, capeweed, nettles, nightshades, as I said before, they're coming in to soak up that nitrate. And yeah, they're a nice sign. You'll often see them on stock camps, or, in very, areas where there's been a lot of manure, cattle manure, sheep manure. You'll often see nettles and fat hen coming through. So they're a real, I find the nitrate ones often, to me, also indicate a breakdown in soil food web. As I said before, there's, bacteria in the soil carry and hold a lot of nitrogen. And if there's nothing to cycle those, no higher order predators in the soil food web to cycle that nitrogen through, it gets released into the soil, and these plants are just soaking it up. So once the soil food web is more balanced and we have a healthier soil biological community, then I think that can do some of these weeds out of a job. Bare soils is a classic. The minute you have bare soil, I find you see weeds you have never saw before when there was ground cover. Things like purslane, the really prickly ones like cathead burrs, any kind of burrs tend to be a real sign of a very bacterial soil that really, it has been bare ground, basically. And I really believe bare ground's behind a lot of these weeds, to be honest, because it opens the door for seeds to germinate. Nature doesn't leave things empty. It's going to put plants there. So, the invasive grasses are also coming about through our grazing management, creating spaces or creating selection of the more palatable species that they can come through. We're basically opening the door a little bit, I think. And this term sleepy soils I kind of adopted from Nicole Masters, but it is that they're those woody weeds They tend to, be quite challenging. A lot of them are declared noxious weeds like blackberry and lantana. And they're hard to get rid of. They're really challenging. And I find that most of those weeds, when I start to look around the different contexts I've worked in, they're often in areas that we don't get a lot of grazing impact, or they've been disturbed or overgrazed at some point. And then they're hard to move on, and it's really about finding ways to kind of manage them, because you'll spray and they'll just keep coming back. Often birds spread seeds, things like that. So yeah, it is really interesting. I think these soils are just lacking in a bit of disturbance and maybe needing a bit of impact, but then it's a bit of a chicken and egg, isn't it, trying to get impact when there's prickly plants that they don't want to eat. We find you guys probably don't have blackberries so much up there, but we find animals love to graze the blackberry. It's just keeping it down and stopping it taking over and leaving it as diversity. But I know lantana can be poisonous, and some of the weeds that fill that niche in other contexts aren't great options there. So you've got to really take the weed in context and what its properties are, and deal with it accordingly. But sometimes I feel like it is that, low impact. They're just, they're kind of gone to sleep, and the soils are just sitting there, not really active biologically. And these plants are coming in, they're growing, they're trying to do a job, they're trying to build soil for us. But it isn't always, things aren't moving. They sort of move really slowly with these plants, and we do get impatient. A bacterial soil with really low biological activities, classic is cooch, kikuyu, those really invasive type grasses. Johnson's grass is another one. And you guys know a lot of the weeds that came through the survey of Parramatta grass, giant Parramatta grass, the rat's tail, the one you have up there, which is a bit different to the one we call rat's tail down here. And again, if you're watching this video and you're not from the coastal context, there's different rat's tails, I think, in different areas. We have rat's tail fescue, and you guys have a different type, but that, often it's that low biological activity. When you saw that plant succession diagram, these are sitting right at the beginning. So if we got these type of weeds in our system, we've really got to find out how we can move the soil biological health to a higher system, if that makes sense. Lastly, I think this is lastly of my examples of these things are non-mycorrhizal weeds. These guys don't need mycorrhizal fungi. So the brassicas, the fat hens, the sedges don't need mycorrhizal fungi to survive. So they can handle a very disturbed environment. They don't need fungi. Often compacted soils, these guys. So things like pigweed, brassicas, etc. Now, they're probably not the classic weeds you guys are dealing with up at the coast, but it's just interesting to take into account that some of these weeds don't need fungi. And, there's a heap of resources you can use to kind of troubleshoot the different plants you're dealing with and find alternative ways to manage them. So you saw that you're already trying a lot of different things to manage weeds, like cover crops, soil biology, compost teas. Composts are great. Grazing management's a huge one. There's so many different ways we can do them. And from the questionnaires, you're already trying a lot of things, I guess. And it is, I guess, trying them in a strategic approach is more useful than trying them randomly. So once you get to know the plant that you're looking to do out of a job, is starting to understand where it sits in that whole successional process. What's its role in the ecosystem? What's it trying to do, and what's nature put it there for? And then you can start to figure out ways to either put alternatives in place or move it on and do it out of a job. And there's so many tools in the toolbox which you guys are using already. Restoring soil health is huge, because that's how we help to create, the conditions for what we need. Slashing, people are using already. The one thing I think, it's easy to try and use these things like slashing, cover crops, some people try weed teas, weed extracts, compost teas, etc. The one that I think is the most powerful over time is the one I see being used probably the least, and I'm not in every context, but it's grazing management, because that helps shift biology, it helps shift everything. And a lot of the invasive grasses are coming about because we're opening the door to them through our grazing management. And the only context I've seen people get a handle on those invasive grasses are people who've improved their grazing management, and they still might be part of the diversity in their pasture, but they're not taking over like they were, simply because the animals, if they've got unpalatable grasses, they're not going to eat them. They're going to eat all the good stuff, and the unpalatable grasses get a head start. So I can't emphasize enough how important grazing management is in a tool for shifting succession and shifting some of those really, for you guys, it seems like your Parramatta grasses and your rat's tail up there are like what we have down here with, we often have, and someone had African love grass. That's another one we also deal with in this area. Those invasive grasses are filling a role in the ecosystem, and our only way to shift them is through grazing. And that takes time. There's no quick fix in that, but I've seen plenty of places where grazing's improved, and over 5 to 10 years, everything has shifted, but it is a long haul. So, and I think most of these things are, you can inoculate, with biological products and things like that, but it's thinking about the timing and thinking about how that plant can be moved on. Some really exciting things happen though when we just let the plants do their job. And if you're going to try different alternatives, and even if you're still going to use a herbicide, because it's still a tool in the toolbox, the thing is, leave an area so you can see what nature's going to do for you without you spending time, energy, or money on this plant. If we don't leave a little area alone, we don't get to learn from nature. And I've had cases where farmers have said to me, oh, we got calcium to put on the thistles. We didn't put it out and the thistles went anyway. So case in point, just have an area that you leave alone somewhere, and you let nature do what it's doing and you learn from it, because there's times what you're doing is helping things speed it up, but there could be things we're doing thinking we have to do something that actually are just not changing anything in the long term. So it's really nice to have a monitoring area where you can just watch and see what nature's going to do. There's a couple of examples, and I've just forgot I had that slide there. That's really about grazing management. So if you imagine that this picture has a grass that we want to keep in our pasture, but we overgraze it, and the more we hit that with animals, we open the door to these more invasive grasses, because suddenly those desirable plants have nothing left. Their root systems stop growing, and it's gotten smaller in line with the leaf area. Then when we create a grazing situation like that, we're opening the door to the stuff we don't want. They suddenly have room to germinate. And when they grow, the animal comes back and keeps grazing these guys till they go on, and the less palatable grasses get left alone. So it's really, really important that we start to address our grazing management and grazing systems where we can. When we leave a weed alone in a house, this is always tricky, and this is always context. That's why I said principles in context. If you're market gardening and you're cultivating and you're on small areas, it's sometimes harder to leave things alone, but in a grazing situation, if we leave a weed alone, like fleabane, it goes within a year. In a cropping situation, that's not necessarily the case. And I know in the areas where I grow vegetables here, this one comes up every year, and it is because I'm constantly opening up the soil to establish new plants. So we then have to find other ways to manage it in our context and in line with our vision and our values as well, and the time we've got available. But you can see here, this was a client's paddock, and they left that fleabane alone. We actually were so worried about this. We did a step point monitoring technique where if you walk 100 paces along your transect line, and for every pace you mark, you have a line on your boots. Every time you take a pace, you mark what plant is on it. I'm so sorry, my phone's ringing. It's really bad. I'm just going to turn my speaker off. I had the phone on silent and forgot I had a speaker connected. Sorry about that, folks. So yeah, with your step point monitoring technique, you put a line on the tip of your boot. Every step you take, you mark what plant that line is on. And then if you've taken 100 steps, you've got a percentage. Now, this paddock was only 20% fleabane, but then if we take that measurement and we leave it alone, say the next year there's still a bit of fleabane there, and sometimes when we see a weed, our mindset can play tricks on us and we think it's worse than it is. By doing that step point again, we can then see, has that gotten worse or better, and actually put a number around that weed. Also, taking a photo like this is so valuable, so there's different monitoring techniques we can use, but it was interesting that, that was about 20% fleabane. Next year, you can't see any, but we took the monitoring just in case their strategy didn't work, because they didn't want to have a problem. This is here at our place where we had fleabane again in 2021 after fire and drought, and a lot of bare ground, a lot more than we'd ever seen bare ground here before. We had fleabane wall to wall. A year later, nothing. So as you can see, it moves through the system and cycles through. And some plants in different contexts can do that. So it's about, sometimes it's scary to let a weed do that because we're not sure if we'll make it worse. And we've been told so often we will. But in certain contexts and in certain times, and depending on the purpose of that weed, we can see it shift and move through. Sometimes that could take years, and we don't have that time because we're also trying to run a business and trying to do things. So it's take photos, weigh up options, and try a few different strategies until you can see what works for you, I guess is my real message there. But see how that weed could be a resource instead of the enemy. In the case of the fleabane, it was soaking up potassium, it was breaking up compaction, and it was bringing minerals back and just trying to rejig soil processes after the soil had a huge couple of years of horrific disturbances, and so it's coming in and just trying to help set the scene for the next lot of plants to come through. So it's questioning into that, I guess, and starting to look at that, and also asking ourselves, is what I'm doing creating the perfect conditions for the weeds to thrive? Because when we can actually look at that, we then open the door for doing things differently. And this is done with complete self-compassion, because we all do the best we can until we know better, and then we can do better. So, but if we're creating bare ground, we are going to have weeds. And then it's like those weeds are telling us about our soil health and what's going on and what that soil's needing. One of the things I wanted to leave you with today was a bit of a process for reading your weeds. This is something that I've used and I find it really helpful. It helps me to take a whole systems view. Okay. The first thing I would encourage you to do for your problem or challenge plant, or the one you're curious about, is to observe that plant in the field. This means dig a hole, even if it's prickly, wear garden gloves, dig it up and have a look at its root system. Start to observe what it's doing and what's happening while you're doing that in the soil. Has it got a taproot? What's its characteristics? If you use a refractometer, you can take some bricks readings of that plant. And, over time, if you're doing it out of a job, over time, they will be less. And often it's interesting to bricks that the plant we don't want versus the ones we do, and see what our management is favoring. Is the plants we don't want way healthier than the ones we do want? And if so, our management's creating better conditions for the plants we don't want than the ones we do, then we can question into what we're doing and how we can change it. And there's no one answer for that. It's really about questioning into it in the context you're in. The next thing I do is observe soil health. I'm a big believer in monitoring the physical soil health of your soil. When I say this, most people want to go for a chemical soil test. It's only part of the equation. And honestly, it's more important that we measure physical soil health. So using soil health cards, the rapid assessment of soil health manual, visual soil assessment manuals, there's so many free resources out there that you can download and print and measure and monitor the physical soil health, because you're going to be seeing the linkage between the compaction, the structure, the porosity, all of those things. And, all of those things relate to the weeds that are being triggered to grow there. So looking at your soil health, diagnosing those constraints and understanding them is really, really vital. A soil test can be part of that. And sometimes, the weeds we've got are correlating with, say, high magnesium or high sodium or potassium or low calcium function, all those things. But don't neglect to look at the physical soil health as well, and take photos of all of these as you go, photos of everything. But that's my first process, is start to get out in the context and look at what's going on in the plant and what's it doing and what's happening in the soil. Consider the history of that paddock. What's happened there? What disturbances has nature thrown at it? Flooding, fire, drought? What have we overgrazed it, unintentionally or intentionally, just because it was a sacrifice paddock or whatever it was? Have we had a huge history of herbicide fallows? Fertilizer histories impact weeds as well. I had a recent conversation with a client who had shifted, and I'm not saying this is going to work in every situation, but it's an example of how fertilizers can impact. They'd shifted from synthetic phosphorus to a more natural form of phosphorus, and noticed that their cape weed had gone. And everywhere else around them still had it. So it was, clearly linked to something they had been doing. and they're thinking it may have been that. It could have been also their grazing management, could have been a number of things, but those types of what we're doing is impacting the signals we're sending for those plants to germinate. So stop and think about what's been happening there, because that might provide an inkling as well. I love to go down a rabbit hole and actually research the particular plant that I'm curious about. There's some great websites there. I actually do use a lot of the conventional websites on weeds to start. They'll often tell you that this plant likes disturbed areas, or it likes waterlogged soils, or it likes this or that, something else. You'll also get the scientific name of that plant. And then once you know that, there's a lot of really cool books. And I've got a slide with some of my favorites coming up that you can look up those plants and get some inklings on the roles they're playing in the system as well. But sometimes a lot of those books I find have been written in other countries, particularly United States, and they call the weeds different names, and even slightly different genus and species. So it's good to kind of look up the actual scientific name to help you research that plant in some of the really good weed resources that are out there. And yeah, see what you can find out there, because often there's so I think sometimes the weeds, when you look them up, it's textbook, and other times it's not textbook. We're dealing with a complex system and a context, aren't we? Consider those 6 reasons weeds grow as well. Like, is it fulfilling those roles in the system? Consider the ecological processes that we've talked a little bit about. That successional dynamics is really helpful to see where your soil is at in successional terms, but it's also thinking about, what's it doing with mineral cycling? Is solar energy captures really, something's got to be there to photosynthesize, and if the background's bare, nature's going to put it there. And also it's helping to rebuild soil health to improve the water cycle. Like, all of those things could be coming into that weed in your place. What's it trying to do there? Sometimes if you want to dig a little deeper, you can take a leaf tissue test. And it's something you don't have to do that, but if you've got a plant you're really wanting to understand more, I think it's about $60 to send a leaf tissue lab test to EAL and see if that plant's accumulating anything. It can offer. I recently had a client do that on a particular problem where that's nowhere near the context you guys are in, but it was, when I saw the result, it was, oh, of course, but we had been kind of trying to work out a little bit more about it and missing what was really obvious when we saw the leaf test. So it can add a nice dimension to that, and in your own context as well, because I imagine these plants are pretty amazing. They could be accumulating different things in different contexts as well. So it's just a way to start to see what role is that plant playing in the system, and that's one way to dig a little deeper if you're not coming up with much luck. The other thing is stay curious. Like, yeah, we've all got, we'll all have different germination signals and different management systems in different contexts. So it is really like, this is principles applied in context. Just observe and stay curious through the journey. But the most important thing, if you're starting to do different things and you're feeling like nothing's working, start monitoring. Take some photos, set up a line that you can take photos on, or a photo point. Use the step point method I described earlier. If you need any information on that in more detail, just send me an email and I can send you some resources on that. But yeah, just have a way to put some observations around it. Photos are really helpful. And having some numbers with a step point, if you're really stressed, can be really helpful, because you're going to know next year, if that's gotten worse, you can do something different. You're not going to be taking your eye off the ball, because our assessment of weeds, if we don't have some form of monitoring, can be really swayed by mindset or bad mood, or, just what other people think, or someone worrying about it, so it's really, really important. And that monitoring can also be, depending on the plants you're dealing with, obviously in your context, is there a place that for the plants you're dealing with that you can let things grow and watch nature's succession at work and observe? That sometimes can be really helpful too. So I think that's pretty much everything. These are the books that I like on weeds, delving into weeds as indicators. This Wondrous World of Weeds book's actually Australian and written by a herbalist with a very holistic outlook, and it's been the most recent addition to my toolkit. And she covers the medicinal properties, but also a lot of the same things that When Weeds Talk does with a lot of plants we have here in Australia, like some of the soil indicators as well. It's a really interesting book. And most of these are ones where you can sort of look up specific plants have been done in the United States. That's why it's good to put a scientific name on the plant before you delve into them. But I would recommend checking some of those out if you're curious and wanting to build your toolkit a little bit around that. So what I might do now is stop sharing my screen and talk a little bit about some of the bigger weeds you guys had, but also attend to your questions. I think I'll just leave that there. I'm sure there's plenty because there's a lot of information in a short time I've just thrown at you all. So I'm just checking the chat box. Yeah, and I've covered that 1 year seeding, 7 years weeding, hope. Like for me, it's germination signals, because when you see a plant you've never seen before in over 7 years, sometimes 20, there's something else going on there, I think. Nutgrass is a tricky one. And I didn't say that was the sedges that were growing in very anaerobic soils, but nutgrass is a little different and it is very hard to move on. We are trying to deal with onion weed, which is very similar to nutgrass, by building more fungal dominated soil, but it's still very, very slow. So it's not getting worse, but it's hard to move on. And some of them you really do have to try and improve approaches, I think. So yeah, I guess I'll wait for a few more questions to pop up. Please feel free to put your hand up, might be the easiest option, rather than knowing, it's hard sometimes to know when to jump in. But I know lantana was huge, and I know I looked it up and did a bit of a study, because I haven't had to manage lantana personally, but my husband has, and he's not a fan of it. I know there's biosecurity duties. I know it's also can be toxic at times. So it's got a lot of complexities around it, and it's so invasive. So yeah, and I think it could be filling a niche very similar to what I'm familiar with blackberry. They both are spread by birds and spread quite readily. So it's in the textbooks, it's sort of a low calcium, low phosphorus kind of role in the minerals, which a lot of weeds are calcium function. It comes up so often. And it also, when weeds talk, suggests it's high in potassium and magnesium, low humus. Yeah, so that's a little bit to think about. But I think those really invasive weeds, they're a whole complex long-term approach, aren't they? Trying to understand how you can do it out of a job. I'm seeing a few questions in the comments. Water weeds are the same. Oh yeah, water weeds is totally a whole other ball game, isn't it? And I can't really add to that much because I haven't had to deal with the water weed myself, but it would probably, I would imagine some of those would thrive, if there's different chemicals or minerals in water or different conditions. Some of them do need shallow water or deep water. Their conditions are very similar. We could apply the same approach to try and understand it. Blady grass, I know that one well. It really loves our conditions, low phosphorus soils. And we found impact with grazing has really helped open it up. So you're getting a bit of grazing impact in there. Since we burned, it lost its hold a little bit, but it's still there. But our grazing management just keeps building and bringing more diversity through. It's really trying to get, knock it down and get some light in though. It is a real challenge. But we find it loves, for me, I see it a lot in low phosphorus soils. So I hope that helps. But it is, yeah, we are seeing it's not getting worse through grazing management. And we did get, open a bit of it up at time. If need of impact, we've that needs a paddock for a little bit, he might get put in the blady grass for a little while, as long as he holds his condition, to get a bit of impact in there. Yeah, and that's how we are approaching blady grass. But again, different contexts, different situations. It seems to grow a lot here in the more waterlogged areas too. So I wonder if that's a little bit of a trick with blady. Yeah, feel free to come off mute if you want to ask a question. I don't know if you've got any questions, Andrew. It's a lot of information. trying to apply context.
Yeah, I think there was one there. Someone was wondering about Soteria, which I guess is obviously contextual.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I'm
I
not
mean,
really
it's a good grazing pasture, I find, but yeah, it's not something you necessarily want in your market garden.
exactly. And that's the same. There's so many weeds that are a weed in only one context, aren't they? And other times they're great,
Mm.
like ryegrass. If it's in a cropping
Yeah,
country, they hate it, and in a
we
dairy,
do
they
have a
love it.
market gardener. Yeah, I don't know, Miranda, what your context was there, but we do have an organic market gardener here in the Shire. They use Ceteria. It's actually one of their cover crops. So they do their garlic and ginger, and then let Ceteria grow because it's got such a good biomass and deep root. And then they just turn it over and turn it in, mulch, and plant into it again. So that's one use.
Mm,
Ceteria being a positive. Um,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, which is
yeah.
interesting.
And I think
Mm.
it's really about considering the right tools in your situation and using a combination. We also need to be patient. And I guess when we go for the quick fix, we think we're going to get a result quicker, but often we end up just spraying the same weed in the same place every year. And I know we've both experienced that in our own lives. And yeah, just taking care to find some way to monitor whether you're going forwards or backwards, whether things are shifting or not, because nature's going to put place there to fill the role. It's just trying to work out what that might be, I guess. And yeah, are we going to focus on killing, or are we going to bring life in? That's really the decision, isn't it? And support life. And fireweed's not one I have on the top of my head, Brooke. But if you send me an email, I can look it up for you. It's not one I have had to deal with
Yeah,
here. And I know.
yeah. Fireweed.
What
Sorry.
do you think, Andrew? Yeah. If you think about all those.
Well, it's quite common here.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, fireweed I often see as an indicator of compaction. It really seems to thrive in compacted soils. And back to your was it your process of weeds? The good thing with fireweed, often if you pull that out of the ground, you'll see the roots often grow very well across
Yeah.
the soil. So they're obviously very good at utilizing that soft top layer
Yeah.
to grow, cover the soil, and do what they're trying to do. So often a sign of compaction, I find, around here. Mm.
Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, and a lot of those types of weeds, it's calcium, it's compaction, it's all of the things, isn't it? Like there's often a number of contributing factors. And I think
Mm.
the weeds are incredibly amazing though. Like one weed can fulfill a different niche in a different place too. So it's being open and
Yeah.
curious. There's no textbook answer to any of them. It's just get to know them in your context and start to see, what is this plant doing? What can I do instead? What else would,
Mm.
how can I, because if we take that weed out, then that role has to be filled by something. So sometimes that's minerals or, how do we fill that ecosystem niche in the system with something else? And is that us with inputs, or is that us with another plant, or moving the system onto a higher successional level so that that plant's no longer needed? And that takes time. There's no quick fix there. Um, yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting topic. Controlling Parramatta grasses came in the questions. I mentioned the grasses, and I did look up Parramatta grass. So I've just got some notes in front of me to jog my memory. And yeah, because it came through, and so did the giant rat's tail grass. They all seem to be very similar types of grasses. And from what I can understand of them, and I see them filling a niche very similar to some grasses I'm very familiar with, it's they're invading pastures and they're not so palatable. So our grazing management's a key. So if we have a grass that's not palatable and we're not conscious of managing the impact of our grazing animals on the desirable species, that grass can quickly take a hold. So it's sometimes a matter of measuring our grazing impact on the plants we want, managing for what we want, not leaving them there so long that they've eaten everything we want, and then they're leaving those less palatable grasses to get an even greater advantage in the scheme of things. And so I think we've got to do everything we can to avoid bare grounds as well. There's a fungi to control Parramatta grass. That's exciting. It's avoid bare ground, always manage for ground cover, manage for what you want, but really pay attention to your grazing. And yeah, if we have bare ground, we open the door to all sorts of weeds, because nature's not going to leave it bare. I've seen paddocks where invasive grasses like Parramatta grass have been in one paddock and in the same farm, not in another paddock, and it was purely paddock size and grazing impact. And the farmer was showing me the difference that subdividing his paddocks had made on a grass that fills the same niche as Parramatta grass. So I'm really big on grazing management in those instances, because it's a long-term approach, but it's really managing for what we want, and it's crucial. Yeah, and it does take time. Yeah, and then someone here growing lab over less palatable grasses. Yeah, you can do some of that pasture cropping, can't you, to try and also boost life and move things through and provide diversity. There's so many tools in the toolbox. Cover cropping, green manuring. The other thing I think of a lot, if you're in a cropping system, that comes up a lot is back in the day, pasture lays were a thing where, no one crops the same area constantly. And we've started to, I think, in cropping systems, pushing that ground into crops very regularly without giving it a rest in pastures. And they did that for a reason, because the soil was restoring, and it was having a break from the cropping. And I think that's got some merit to kind of look at those principles and go, can I use something like that? Can I take an area out of crop and graze it for a little while and give it a bit of a, grazing management's key, but can that help give the soil a rest and reboot it a little bit? Yeah, and blady grass grazing management's work for Simon on that. Yeah, it's really opened it up here. And yeah, it's definitely not getting worse, it's getting better, going away. It's not like quick fix, but it definitely works over time. Yeah, if you stay the course with it. Yeah, so that's great. Any other comments or questions? Andrew, do you have any questions they're probably dying to ask that they're just not wanting to come off mute for?
I don't think so. I think yeah, it's been great. There's something come through there with the fungi. Yeah, and that's the other thing. So Mary's mentioned there about the fungi that the beechwood guys do. It is a timing thing.
Yeah.
And it's a slower approach. Obviously, it's
Yeah.
inoculating a particular fungi that will stop the Parramatta grass, but timing is what I know pretty crucial. Obviously, moisture and time of year. But the guys at Beechwood, there's a guy called Jeremy there who's really knowledgeable on that topic, and he would give some really good info on that. There's actually a Facebook group. Might be mid coast micro herds or something. I'll have to look it up. I can probably put a conversation there using violet on
Mid coast micro is Gavin in there. Yeah, you've just frozen up a bit there, Andrew. I know we've got you back on. Mark has a great question on grazing management being similar to slashing and mowing. And yeah, definitely, it's certainly a great tool if you can't get the impact in. The hardest challenge is always steep country. And I know you guys probably have a bit of that over there. That's always a challenge with weeds, just when you've got to manage steep areas. But yeah, slashing and mowing is a great tool in the toolbox when you don't have the animals to get the impact. Yeah, and I've noticed here that tool works better in it's timing again. And sometimes it works better than others. It's just in our seasonal context here is very different. And I guess you guys have a different seasonal context there, but we find sometimes a mow can really promote the desirables and other times things stall a bit. But yeah, it definitely lets light in. It helps, slashing and mowing weeds. I've seen that can actually help move the successional process on a little bit too, if you can cut things back for that speed, but the plant still has a chance to do its job. Over time, in areas where that's happened over time, I have seen that successional process moving through a landscape. I don't know if anyone else has observed that, but definitely by brush cutting, slashing, mowing, you open the door for light and you can try and help, you're stopping seed set and you're helping things move along in some cases. Like it depends on the context and the weed, but I have seen that I've been able to witness plant succession in motion in an area here where we've done that, and it's been really interesting. Yeah. Please feel free to ask more questions. Just checking I haven't missed any. Chat box or come
I
off
think
mute.
got some good inquiries there. But yeah, I think I mean, was thing on Farmers Friends, which I feel is probably one of the least threatening, maybe. Much as they annoy us.
Yeah, Farmers Friends, Cobbler's Pegs, disturbed soil, low calcium, low phosphorus, high mag sometimes. I don't know if you guys see it. It loves black soils over this way. Often low humus and compacted soil. Yeah. Is that one, because it came up a few times, and so did camphor laurel came up a few times too, and that was another. It's sort of a challenge that I'm not that familiar with, but it seems to be, I think, a case of disturbed environments in your high rainfall climate. But again, it was a tricky one to find much insight in textbook wise. So that's really up to your observational skills and using those principles I've gone through to find the niche and find the way to understand what job it's doing. The other one that came up a few times, I sort of just went down the rabbit hole of what was coming up regularly. I hope Andrew had to spawn. That's not good. And Brackenfern was another one that came up a lot. It's one I'm also familiar with. Very low calcium, really high sandy, well-drained soils. Yeah, ones that are quite nutrient depleted. And I think it's just trying to protect the site, really. Yeah, that was the bracken. So those are the ones that came up repeatedly on the notes that I saw, that I did do a bit of an exploration on. But, I'm happy to, if you've got a specific one and you want to just send me an email if I have anything on it, I'll let you know. I sort of collect a lot of this observational and document it as I go, but there's so many weeds and so many contexts that to do a webinar and cover them all, we'd be here all week, wouldn't we?
Absolutely. But just on the camp one though, Kim, because I know that's a big one around here, and again, I've found that that can be grazed away or managed with grazing. The camp is unique in the sense that it can germinate amongst pasture, but generally it will only germinate in pasture that's not grazed.
Okay.
So if you've got pasture, obviously all pasture wants grazing management, and if you've got good grazing management, that camphor will stay as a little seedling or get grazed away, trampled away. Yeah. If you leave it, obviously that, and you see that everywhere around here, anywhere that had grass and then just been left, camphors are the first trees really to come in and start trying to turn it back to forest, because that's what nature's trying to do in this context, really, is trying to get back to forest.
Yep. And in your context, I think it could move that much quicker because you get more rain and warmth, you know.
Yeah.
So that process is like here, it seems painfully slow at times because we get cold and frosty and we don't get as much rain as you guys. But yeah, in that climate where it's such a high growth area and humid and, warm, I can imagine that process. You may have the ability to move things quicker. It's an interesting one.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of the threat comes from, I think, in our management, seeing that fast growth and trees can come in and take over areas if they're left very quickly.
Yeah, then they can, we're here, it's a very different, in every plan in place, isn't it, really? And welcome for the step point method. It's really simple, and it is like, it helps if you do a step point. I hope I explained it clearly, but if you do want a little score sheet and a bit more of an explanation, I do have that and I'm happy to share it. And it's helpful to have two people. One can write down and one can step, because when I do that by myself, I can't count my steps and do it all, and it's hard because you're kind of checking off the weed versus the others, and you're measuring and managing and weed or not weed. And you can use that technique to monitor ground cover. You can do it for a diversity of like pasture composition. It's a really simple monitoring tool that you have in your toolkit that helps take the stress, and it helps you see the change over time. Am I getting worse, better? Take the guesswork out of it a little bit. Yeah, it's just something that I think, we could all do more of it.
Observe, isn't it? And then once it stops, observe some more.
Exactly. And whatever tool you're using in your toolkit for big management, good to know or not, isn't it?
Falei,
Yeah.
contribuía.
Did you have a question, Gavin? He's just off mute. No, he's good.
No,
Good.
well, I think that's yeah. I think I've got all the questions. Got some great questions and good answers. Good chat. So yeah, thanks for everyone from participating, and thanks for all that great info too. It's great seeing different people's problem weeds and strategies that they've used. So yeah, and thank you. Thanks, Kim, for addressing everything so well. That was great.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share all the little tidbits of things I'm collecting. And it's not constant evolution. And I know that we're all still learning and on this learning journey together. So, we all just, it's nice to contribute when you've been collecting a bit of knowledge or observations on a topic, but I'm sure that it's so fascinating. You just keep learning, don't you? And that's the thing, stay curious.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, yeah, it never ends. That's cool. Yeah.
No, I find it
Thank
fascinating
you.
topic. So thanks so much for having me and the opportunity to share. And for those of you who've joined live, or if you're watching the recording, thanks.
Beautiful.
Be good. Well done.
Yeah, well, thanks so much.
Oh, no worries, Andrew. I couldn't believe the